Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. And we're going to continue to go over the Nag Hammadi scriptures. And here's the book here. This particular book is from Harper One, Harper Collins Publishers, and it says it's $39.99 and then $50 in Canada, but you can actually pick this up less than half of that price, and it is well worth it. I highly recommend it. What an amazing book. And so we're going to continue to go over that today, and we're going to get into the book of Thomas. But before we get into the book of Thomas, I want to preface by talking a little bit about the three streams of Christianity. We're also going to be talking about Buddhism a lot, or the Buddha and Buddhism today, as well as the Essenes. And I'm going to talk about the person who founded the Essenes. And we're going to talk about the Gnostic Jesus and Mary as well. So, but you can see here that I list the three streams of Christianity: Peter, Paul, and John. Peter, and you can see that Peter represents the body, Paul the soul, and John the spirit. And so Peter means in French it's Pierre, which is stone or rock, and that really represents the lowest form, the mineral form. And Jesus said, quote, "On this rock I will build my church." And you can read that in Matthew 16:18, chapter 16, verse 18. And so, but Jesus did not say, "This rock will become my church." He did not say, "This rock will represent my church." He said, "On this rock I will build my church." So Peter doesn't represent the church. He did not found the church. He simply represents the foundation that the church would sit on. Think of a foot on a stool. So Peter is the footstool, but not the foot. And then, of course, Peter represents the Catholic Church. That's the lowest stream of Christianity. And then the next is Paul, the Paul stream, or Pauline stream. And it, you can consider sola scriptura. It represents the soul. And really, the Paul stream is the Protestant stream, which is just Catholicism in a different form. And then, of course, the Johannine or John stream represents the spirit, and it's the most spiritual and esoteric out of the three. And you can they talk about the John or the Johannine stream or Johannine stream being a seed in the East among the Russian and Slavic people back when Rudolf Steiner was teaching. Of course, today that seed has grown and it's growing, and so but the John stream will lead to Buddhi or life spirit and the return of Maitreya Buddha. We're going to be talking about Buddhism and Buddha a lot today. Of course, the life spirit in Sanskrit, it's the word Buddhi, and then in Greek, Christos. And you think of Christos, you think of Christ, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'll continue. We're going to talk about Buddhism, Yesh Ben Pandira, and the Essenes, and also the Gnostic Jesus. So Siddhartha Gautama, commonly referred to as the Buddha or Gautama Buddha, was born the prince of the Shakyas or Shakyas. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Shakyas. So after he attained enlightenment, Gautama Buddha was known as Shakyamuni. Now I'm going to read a section of the book entitled Steiner and Buddhism from chapter 9, entitled The Relationship Between Maitreya Buddha and the Christ Being. So, and this is, I'm going to read from page 39, which is chapter 9. Here's a look at the book that I'm going to read from. I'm only going to read a sentence or two. It'll just take a moment, but you should find this interesting. And I highly recommend this book. It's pretty good. It's a very thin book. It's only 100 pages or so, but it's really, really valuable, and it's only around $10. But let me go to this section. According to Steiner, after Shakyamuni passed away, there was a person who became a successor on earth and performed the Bodhisattva practice and prepared for the event of Golgotha. Nearly a century before Jesus' birth, the Bodhisattva was incarnated into that person who was called Yesh ben Pandira. This person is the leader of the Essenes sect, a sect of Judaism. And it says here, Steiner says he was a different person from Jesus. The Bodhisattva who was incarnated by Yesh ben Pandira is a spiritual being who returns to earth many times every century. So every 100 years he returns to earth. And but in the future he will finally become Buddha and incarnate on earth as Maitreya Buddha. So I apologize. I said that Yesh ben Pandira founded the Essenes, but the book didn't say that. As I reread it, it said he was the leader of the Essenes, which doesn't necessarily mean he founded the Essenes. But now you'll find I got some more information from the book that I just read from, but I kind of summarized it here. And it talks about Buddhism. This is from Steiner now. All of this information is from Steiner. And the author, Shinji Gyoten, he gives all the references from where he got the information from Steiner's books. I checked it out. This is very accurate. And so Steiner talked about Buddhism is spreading the Christ impulse to all people. So before we talked about the John stream, but it's not just the John stream, it's Buddhism is spreading the Christ impulse to all people. Now, Christ now appears in an etheric body. So if you are clairvoyant, you can perceive the etheric Christ right now. And Christ can reveal himself to anybody that he wants to. And so, but in the future, Christ will appear to people as Maitreya Buddha. But again, that'll be etheric. That's going to be, Maitreya Buddha is going to be an etheric being. And more people should be able to perceive the Buddha at that time. More people will have etheric vision. And so now we're going to talk about, for a moment, the two Jesuses. So there's two Jesus children that are presented in the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew presents a Jesus. And they both give the genealogies. So if you study Matthew and if you study Luke, you'll notice that they both give the genealogies. But they try to confuse you because they give the genealogies in reverse order. One of the genealogies is listed from father down to son, and the other one's listed backwards, I believe. But if you study them closely, you'll notice that they both line up, both genealogies line up, and they're the same all the way up till King David. And after King David, that's where they change. So King David had more than one son, and so he had Solomon was a son, King Solomon. He also had Nathan that was a son. And so Matthew, the Jesus in Matthew, is a descendant of Solomon, and you could read that right in the genealogy. And so that's linked to Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, is how Dale Brunsfeld pronounces it. And Zarathustra, I'm going to pronounce, I didn't even spell that correct. I apologize. But there should be another O here. Squeeze that in there. But so when I say Zarathustra, I'm talking about Zoroaster. And so Zoroaster entered into the Solomon Jesus. And the mission or the message of Zoroaster was to present the God of the universe, as opposed to these lower gods or lower beings, spiritual beings. So that was the message and the mission of Zoroaster. And then Luke, the Nathan Jesus that's presented in Luke, well, that Jesus was incarnated by Buddha, or the Buddha spirit entered the Nathan Jesus, and Zarathustra entered the Solomon Jesus. Now, the mission of Buddha is different than the mission of Zarathustra. The mission of Buddha is to spread love and compassion. So you have one that's presenting the God of the universe, the Most High God, and then you have the other one who is the mission is to teach and to spread love and compassion. So here is a small chart that I made, and it refers to the solar logos. And so we'll talk for a moment about the solar logos. Again, all of this information that I'm talking about here for the last couple of minutes is from Rudolf Steiner, and it's summarized in this book right here. I highly recommend this book, Steiner and Buddhism, The Mission of Buddha as a Christ Being. And so we'll talk for a moment about the solar logos. And the solar logos, you have Zerwan, or Zervan is the more common way to spell it, and represents Zarathustra. Mithra represents or is associated with Buddha, and Ahura Mazda is associated or reference to Christ. So those are the three, the supreme three. Then you have the triple sun, which is the Sun, Mercury, and Venus. And sometimes Venus is a term that's used for Mercury in esoteric science. So sometimes those two can get confused. And then you have the Trinity. But what do you see here? All threes. The supreme three, the triple sun, and the Trinity. I'm noticing all threes. So that's kind of interesting. Another thing to keep in mind is that when Rudolf Steiner talks about the cosmos and he talks about these inner planets, he's actually referring to supersensible perception. So a lot of times we're not talking about the physical planet. We're talking about the way the planet is through supersensible perception or clairvoyant vision. But back to where I'm getting at with all of this, Jesus, and we talked about the Essenes, Yesh Ben Pendira and the Essenes, talked about Buddhism a little bit. Now, Jesus was an honorary member of the Essene community. And also John the Baptist was as well, but John the Baptist was not an honorary member. He was what's called a lay member. So John, for example, John the Baptist got his water baptism and his coat made of camel's hair from the Essenes. The Essenes practiced water baptism, and the Essenes wore coats made of camel's hair during cold weather. And like Jesus and John, the Essenes were persecuted by the Jewish religious authorities because of their Gnostic doctrine. So Jesus and John, what they would do is they would go out and they would teach in these desert or wilderness locations. And so, and a lot of these areas where they would teach, these desert and wilderness locations, were adjacent or right next to the different Essene communities. For example, Lazarus was raised in Bethany beyond Jordan. Don't confuse Bethany beyond Jordan with the other Bethany. There's two Bethanies. Bethany beyond Jordan is actually very close to Qumran, Qumran, Qumran. And the reason why that's significant is because Qumran, you could actually see Bethany beyond Jordan from Qumran. If you're up high enough, you can see it. It's within visual sight. That's how close it is. And now Qumran was the headquarters of the Essenes. That was their main headquarters, and it was in a very remote desert location to avoid the persecution of the Jewish religious authorities. So, but the point, though, is that the Essenes were Gnostic Jews. Now, for more information about the three streams of Christianity, there's going to be a link in the description for the playlist. You can look at last week's video that I went over a little bit more detail, the three streams of Christianity. I listed the names of the churches and stuff. And there's also a link in the description for my previous Bible study series, where I go over the four canonical Gospels, as well as the book of Jude, I believe I went over as well. But before I forget, so it's easy to know that the Peter Church is Catholic and the Paul Church is Protestant, but it's not so easy to get information on the Johannine or John stream. But you can find a church in California. I believe it's called the Christian Community Church, and that's actually was founded by people who are students of Rudolf Steiner. And again, you can look at my video last week for more information on that. And then, of course, some of the churches among the Russian and Slavic people. And I'm part Slavic myself. I'm not Russian, but I'm part Slavic. But you can find some of these Johannine or John churches among the Russian and the Slavic churches. And you can also consider the Coptic Church as well. Right now we're going to go over a book entitled The Nature of the Rulers before we get into the book of Thomas. Not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, which we already went over in a previous video. So the nature of the rulers. We'll go over that, and that's in here, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, and I'm going to subtitle it "The Real Nature of the Authorities." Because when we talk about rulers, we're talking about the authorities. That includes the authorities today. And so the nature of the rulers, the book is labeled a Sethian, it's labeled Sethian thought, or a Sethian book, after Seth, the son of Adam. And it's attributed to Paul after his experience with Christ on the road to Damascus. So like most of the books in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, it's basically a translation of Coptic texts into English. But they say that a lot of the texts they believe were originally in Greek, which is interesting, and not in Coptic. But here, they're translating them from Coptic, so I really put a lot of emphasis on Coptic as opposed to Greek, because we're not some of them may be translated from Greek into English, but most of these books in the Nag Hammadi scriptures are from Coptic into English. So the real nature of the authorities we'll talk about here. You know from the four Gospels in the Bible that Jesus was pursued by both religious and state authorities who wanted to kill him. State authorities sought his life as a child, as soon as he was born. And then later in his life, the state authorities crucified Jesus at the demand of the Jewish religious authorities. And so other Gnostics like John the Baptist and the Essenes, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they were also persecuted by the authorities. So the Essenes had a headquarters in Qumran, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago. And later in history, the Roman Catholic authorities worked with state authorities to destroy groups like the Cathars, Cathars, you can check that out in history, and also the Knights Templar. This book will explain who the authorities are and who they represent, or who they represent. So I'll begin by reading the first chapter, which is labeled chapter 86 for some reason, and it's entitled The Real Nature of the Authorities, which reads as follows. And the reason why it may start out as chapter 86 is because, they're codexes. There's, I think, 3 or so codexes, and then what they do is they might be jumping around as they present the books here. They might be jumping around from one codex to another. I'm not fully. I'm still figuring it out, the format of the Nag Hammadi scriptures. But what I want to read to you now from chapter 86, it reads as follows. Concerning the reality of the authorities, the great apostle, through the Spirit of the Father and of truth, referred to the authorities of darkness and told us, quote, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the authorities of the world and the spirits of wickedness, unquote. I have sent you this writing because you have asked about the real nature of the authorities. And it says, and I say that the top authority, when I talk about the authorities, I'm referring to, the top authorities. And when we refer to the authorities, those are the archons, Archons. And it says that the authorities are archons. And we know from the Rosicrucian teachings that archons are retarded archi, also known as the spirits of darkness. And for more information on the archons and the archon, the archai. An archai is another term for eons, but the eons are the good ones, the ones that continued their development, and then the retarded ones are archons. But they're all archai. For more information on that, you can see my previous video where I went over that already. And I just put a little information up here to make it a little more clear, just to go over it again briefly, so we know what we're talking about as we read through the Nag Hammadi scriptures. So the eons, aeons, however you pronounce it, that refers to the archai. The archons are retarded archai. Both serve the Elohim. They're both servants of the Elohim, the eons and the archons. Now the archons, when I say retarded, that they're retarded archai, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Rudolf Steiner uses that term as well, and we talk about that in the Rosicrucian teachings. What we mean by that is the archons, they have certain characteristics. Let me start up here, read this properly. They're slow in their evolution compared to the regular eons. So they're a little bit slow in their evolution, and as a result, they have retained certain characteristics from their old Saturn existence, which unfolded in darkness without light, and that's the reason why the archons are referred to as the spirits of darkness. Now we're going to talk about the next section entitled "The Blind Demiurge," chapter 86. 27 through 87:23. I made it just like they have it in the Bible, chapter and then verse, to make it easy. And I'm going to compare this to Rudolf Steiner's temple legend, which is very interesting. So it reads as follows. The leader of the authorities is blind. Because of his power, ignorance, and arrogance, he said with power, quote, "I am God, there is no other but me," unquote. When he said this, he sinned against the realm of the all. This boast rose up to incorruptibility, and a voice answered from incorruptibility and said, quote, "You are wrong, Samael," unquote. And Samael, Samael, that means blind God. That's what Samael means. So, Samael, it means blind God or God of the blind. It could mean both, either one. So incorruptibility is a female eon or archai, and related to Barbello. We went over that, I believe, in the first video of this course. Barbello represents divine forethought. So Samael was not an archai. He was an archon, which is a retarded archai. The archons and the archai are servants of a higher group of beings known as the Elohim, as I mentioned a moment ago. And the Elohim are also known as the Exousiai, or the powers. Jehovah, for example, is a member of the Elohim. And I believe I heard Rudolf Steiner say that Ahriman was a retarded Elohim, but don't quote me on that. I've been trying to verify that, and I haven't been able to. The temple legend is presented by Rudolf Steiner, but Steiner did not invent the legend. The temple legend states that Samael was an Elohim, but a more accurate statement would be to say that Samael was a servant of the Elohim. which is not a big deal because Samael is not the point or focus of the temple legend. Haram Abiff is the point and focus of the temple legend, along with Tubal Cain and the molten sea and the spiritual meaning behind the story. Of course, the temple legend is something that relates to Freemasonry, which is an ancient craft that originated from light itself, according to the Rosicrucian teachings. While speculative Freemasonry is regarded as an empty husk or shell compared to the operative Freemasonry that it replaced, in the future the husk will be filled with light again and will serve an important role for humanity. And as a Freemason myself, this topic is one of my favorites, the temple legend and stuff like that. I like talking about it. So I'm going to continue reading where I left off as follows. Incorruptibility said, "You are wrong, Samael," which means blind God. His thoughts were blind. He expressed his power, which is the blasphemy that he uttered, and pursued it down to chaos and his mother, the abyss, at the instigation of Pistis Sophia, which means faith wisdom. She established each of his offspring according to its power, after the pattern of the eternal realms above. And by she, it's referring again to Pistis Sophia, faith wisdom. And it continues by saying, "For the visible originated from the invisible. Incorruptibility looked down into the waters. Her image appeared as a reflection in the waters, and the authorities of darkness fell in love with her. But they could not grasp the image that appeared to them in the waters, for they were weak, and what is only of soul cannot grasp what is of spirit. For the authorities were from below, but the image of incorruptibility was from above. This is why incorruptibility looked down into that region, so that by the Father's will she might bring all into union with the light." And that's the last part that I wanted to read directly from the book. I did forget to mention something, though. When I'm talking about the authorities, right? And we're talking about the spirits of darkness, the archons. You know, we're not talking about everyone on earth that's in a position of authority. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about those who are in the highest positions of authority and some of the most wealthiest people in the world. You know, we're talking about the very, very elite, which is just a few. You know, there are many people, thousands and thousands of people in positions of authority, but they're regular people like you and I, that in their position of authority, they may be serving the archons, and they're not conscious of it. But I'm not saying that everybody in a position of authority is an archon, or is even consciously serving the archons. A lot of times it's just a job. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know who they're serving at the very top, but they're serving the archons. Next, we're going to go into the Book of Thomas, and I'm going to shake things up a little bit here, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, the Book of Thomas refers to Jesus and a so-called twin brother, Jude or Judas Thomas. The scholars in the Nag Hammadi scriptures and the footnotes, that's what they believe. They believe that the Book of Thomas is referring to this twin brother of Jesus's. But I'm going to, and I'm not saying that they're wrong. What I'm going to do, and I'm going to use the Nag Hammadi scriptures, and you can decide for yourself. All I'm doing is I'm presenting the idea that the evidence, in my opinion, the evidence shows that that's a mistake, and that the Book of Thomas actually refers to Mary. And let me explain that. I'll explain that. So, the Gospel of John mentions Thomas Didymus. Now, Didymus is Greek for twin. It doesn't say Jude Didymus or Judas Didymus. It says Thomas Didymus. And Jesus didn't have a brother named Thomas. Mark 6:3, chapter 6, verse 3, says that Jesus was a carpenter with four brothers, and it lists four brothers: James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. Does not say Thomas. Furthermore, Judas Thomas is actually referred to as Jesus's companion. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Jesus only had one companion, and that was Mary. So we're going to go back to the Gospel of Philip as I kind of make my argument that, and I'm not saying that the Book of Thomas is talking about Mary. I'm just saying that the evidence suggests that it's Mary, and I'll explain why. It looks more, based on the evidence, it looks more like Mary. So if you go back, we're going to go back to the book of Philip, which we went over last week, I believe. And we're going to look at chapter 59, verses 6 through 11. I'd like to write that up here for you. Let me put it up here. So if you guys go to Philip, the book of Philip, 59, 6 through 11, is it? Yeah, 6 through 11. I'm going to read it for you. Verses 6 through 11. This is what it says. It says, 3 women named Mary. That's the title of the chapter. And it says, 3 women always walked with the Master: Mary his mother, his sister, and Mary of Magdala, who is called his companion. For Mary is the name of his sister, his mother, and his companion. Just give me a moment. Excuse me for a second. Okay. That's my first point that I want to make, because they also refer to Judas Thomas as his companion. I find that very, very odd. And there's a few other things I find that suggest that it's actually Mary. So next we're going to talk about the Gospel of Thomas, right? And I don't need to write that up there, but I will. If you go to the Gospel of Thomas, right now we're in the book of Thomas, 2 different books. The Gospel of Thomas, it ends, the very ending of it. You read the ending of it. The Gospel of Thomas 1:14, verse 114, Simon Peter said to them, Mary should leave us, for females are not worthy of life. Powerful thing to say, very hateful thing to say. And so Jesus said, look, I shall guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter heaven's kingdom. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Buddhism as well as we move forward. So consider the context of the time, okay? This was a time when women were not accepted as leaders, especially among the Jewish people. Consider the context of Christ. Today, most people don't understand Christ and the teachings. So I think it was even less understood back then when people were even more ignorant and resistant to Christ. Now, the footnote for the Gospel of Thomas, section 114 that I just read, is labeled footnote 196, and it reads as follows. I'm going to read the footnote for you. It says, here the female may symbolize what is earthly and perishable, and the male what is heavenly and imperishable. And so my comment to that is, all it does is attempt to explain what Jesus said as being symbolic, which is okay. I have no problem with that. But I want to reiterate the reason, and that is women were not accepted as leaders. So Jesus would have to change Mary's name and try to present her as a male in order for her to be accepted. Consider that she may have even had a male representative, another disciple with the same name. So, for example, let's say that Jesus initiated her and named her Thomas so that she would be accepted among males. Well, she would have probably also had a representative, another disciple who was also named Thomas, and that would confuse people. Now, we'll talk about the secret language. So the beloved disciple, which is also known as the disciple whom the master loved, that means one who has been initiated by the master. That's what that means. And Mary was initiated by Jesus, and she was clairvoyant, which is why she did not recognize the risen Christ and supposed that he was the gardener, because she was looking through clairvoyant vision. And as she was looking through clairvoyant vision, she didn't recognize the risen Christ, because the risen Christ appeared different than the physical Jesus appeared to ordinary vision. Now, before I read from the book of Thomas, and you're going to find it interesting because it sounds like Jesus is talking to a female, not a male. And it's going to further make my point. It's going to further make my argument. And all my argument is, I'm not arguing that this is talking about Mary. I'm just arguing that I'm asking people to consider it, because I think that the evidence suggests that this is a female and that it's Mary. But before I continue, and I'm going to read from these 2 sections, I'll read it word for word for you guys, for anyone that doesn't have the book. By the way, I recommend getting the book. I'm not going to read every single book from the Nag Hammadi scriptures, and I'm not going to read every single verse from the books that I do read. So I recommend getting the book. But before I read, there's a point I want to make, another point to my argument. And it is, there's a book of Mary. We're going to get to that eventually. We're going to talk about the book of Mary eventually. But we're going to talk about it now briefly. The book of Mary was destroyed. It was, I don't know how they destroyed it, but it was, somebody attempted to burn it or destroy it. And there's like a sentence or two that survived. And you'll know when we get to the book of Mary. And basically, the little tiny paragraph or whatever that survived out of the whole book, it pretty much is showing how Peter hates Mary, and how the disciples lost faith, and Mary was encouraging them, and she became the leader. But Peter didn't like that. And Peter and his brother kind of attacked Mary, not physically, I hope not, but they were being mean to her, and then a couple of the other disciples stuck up for Mary. But my point is, Jesus would have known that this was going to happen. He would have foresaw that these things were going to happen. He would have known that they were going to try to erase Mary from history, and they were going to try to erase her, at least erase her as far as, maybe not from history, because she's certainly in the four canonical gospels, right? But they wanted to minimize her role, and they wanted to erase any mention of her as a teacher, a leader, or a disciple. And in my opinion, they intentionally tried to destroy the Gospel of Mary. But in my opinion, God wouldn't allow it to be completely destroyed. He allowed this small fragment of the Gospel of Mary to survive, so that at least people know that there was a Gospel of Mary. Unfortunately, we can only read about a paragraph of it because the rest of it was destroyed. But I believe that they tried to destroy the whole thing. By miracle, a small portion survived, so that at least people know that there was a Gospel of Mary. And so it would make sense that Jesus would foresee this and changed her name to Thomas. And so, for example, if I'm correct, that was a smart move, because the Gospel of Thomas does survive. It's in very good condition. It's in very good shape. I'm getting ready to read from it in a moment, and it sounds like Jesus is talking to a female. So we're going to start by reading from The Hidden and the Invisible, which is chapter 138, verse 21 through 139, verse 31. We'll begin with that. And it reads as follows. How will you be called workers? The Savior said, quote, all bodies have come into being in the same irrational way that animals are produced, and so they are visible as creatures lusting after creatures. Those that are above, however, do not exist like those that are visible. So Jesus is talking about lust here and comparing it to animals. Remember that point as I continue. And by the way, this reminds me of Freemasonry, because Jesus, it started off by him saying, how will you be called workers? Which refers to builders, right? And they talk about that in Freemasonry, the builders and the workers. So, but you have to think about what I'm reading, right? And it sounds exactly like two things. It sounds exactly like Jesus is talking to a female, but he's also explaining to other people why he is making her appear like a male, changing her name and giving her a buzz haircut, and so that they don't lust after her. She's going to be a leader, not somebody that is, a teacher, not somebody that you want to look at and lust after. And it reminds me of Buddhism today, because in Buddhism today, that's what they do. Is the men completely shave their heads bald, and the females, they get a buzz cut, and no makeup. You're not wearing a skirt or anything like that. And if you look quickly at a female Buddhist, for example, they have the males are abbots and the females are abbotesses. You would think that the female, at a quick glance, you might think that she's a male. I'm going to talk about that more in a few minutes. So next, we're going to read from Wisdom and Foolishness, chapter 139, verse 31 through 141, verse 2. And so, and I'm going to read a short section, and it reads as follows. Again, this is the Savior. Some people have wings, but rush towards visible things that are far from truth. The fire that guides them gives them an illusion of truth. It will shine on them with a perishable beauty, and it will imprison them in dark delight and capture them in sweet smelling pleasure. And it will make them blind with insatiable desire. And so, as I read these excerpts, ask yourself if it sounds like Jesus is talking to a male or a female. Don't only consider the footnotes. Use an open mind. Also, I want to point out that this sounds a lot like an initiation ceremony. So it doesn't just sound like he's talking to a female. It sounds like he may be initiating. Some of these passages sound like they might be taken from when he initiated Mary. And I say that as a 3-time initiate. I'm a 3-time initiate myself. So, but it sounds like, to me, again, like he's talking to a female, and he's also explaining to others, maybe to her and others who may be watching or present, other disciples, why he's changing her to be like a male by giving her a new name or buzz haircut, and no makeup or anything like that. What happened to my blue marker? Oh. And again, I'm not arguing that Jude Thomas was Mary, but I think it's a very, very interesting thing to consider with an open mind when you look at all the points that I'm making. And remember, at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said he will guide Mary to make her a male after Peter asked Jesus to expel her for being female. And Jude Thomas is referred to as Jesus' companion. I mentioned that here. I put it on the board to really drive the point home. I'm going to keep that on the board as long as I can, unless I need room. And so Mary was also referred to as Jesus' companion, along with Judas Thomas. There's a lot of confusion surrounding a lot of the characters in the Gospels. For example, there's a bunch of confusion surrounding the Johns, John Zebedee, Lazarus, the John the beloved disciple. Many people are unaware that the genealogy in Matthew presents a different Jesus than the genealogy of Luke. I went over that earlier to make that point. There's also confusion surrounding James. James Zebedee the elder. And then there's also James, son of Alphaeus, known as the Lesser, James the Lesser. And there's also James the Just, who is mentioned in the Nag Hammadi footnotes. James the Just, brother of Jesus. So There's confusion around those James and which one's which and which scripture refers to which one and stuff like that. And I try to make that stuff clear if I'm able to. In my opinion, there seems to be confusion surrounding Mary and this so-called twin brother of Jesus. An initiated Mary using a male name could be confused with a twin brother of Jesus. This is possible. It's very, very possible. In light of all the other confusion mentioned above. And then another point I want to make is when you look at Leonardo da Vinci's painting, The Last Supper, and hopefully I'll remember to put an image of that for you on the screen. You can look at the Last Supper from Leonardo. It shows a mirror image of Jesus sitting next to him, which can be symbolic of a twin, and their bodies form an M shape, which could stand for Mary or Magdala or marriage, things like that. But the painting, though, basically shows Jesus, the way that they're positioned, it looks like a mirror image, and that could be considered symbolic of somebody who's also referred to as a twin, maybe. Now, this is starting to get a little lengthy, and I try to keep these to under an hour. So I may not keep reading word for word, but we're going to talk briefly about these two sections of the Book of Thomas entitled Our Own and the Others, and then also I'll talk about Jesus preaches about judgment. So in those sections, Jesus is clearly preparing a candidate to lead and teach. And you can go back and you can read those sections if you want to. I'm running out of time. But he's clearly preparing a candidate to lead and to teach. And the question is Jesus preparing this unknown twin brother who isn't a follower or a disciple in the canonical Gospels? Or is Jesus preparing Mary, who was a disciple, so persecuted that even some of the other disciples rejected her? Is Jesus presenting her as a male, knowing females weren't accepted as leaders back then? Remember that Jesus was an honorary member of the Essene community. The founder of the Essene community was Yesh ben Pandira, a Buddhist bodhisattva who prepared the mystery of Golgotha. Today, the Buddhist community is the closest thing that exists to the Essene community. And what do the Buddhists do? They accept women in the monastery, but the women and men live separately. Women are initiated as well into the Buddhist initiation, just like men, but their heads are buzzed instead of shaved completely bald. The women are given basically like a buzz cut, where it's not completely bald, but it's very, very short, maybe an eighth of an inch long or so. Males shave their heads completely bald. But women are made to appear like men, and they're initiated just like men. And that's the way it is. No makeup and a buzz cut. Take Chun Yen Monastery in New York, for example. And a quick glance at a female abbot, known as an abbotess, appears male. But if you look more closely, you can usually distinguish a female abbotess from a male abbot, because usually healthy females generally have better skin, appear younger, and have more perfect facial features. And they have female abbotesses at Chunyan Monastery in New York. That's who's in, the abbot is the one in charge, or the abbotess, and that's who's in charge up there right now. I've met the abbotess a couple of times, and so I'm going to read a little bit from another section. Jesus preaches about judgment, and at the actually, I may not read, I'm not sure. So at the end of the previous section, Thomas is concerned that people won't respect him or listen to him. And now Jesus answers as follows. So this is chapter 142, 26 through 143, 7. In the section entitled Jesus Preaches About Judgment, from the book of Thomas. And it reads as follows. The Savior answered and said, quote, I tell you the truth, whoever listens to your word and turns away or sneers at it or smirks at these things, I tell you the truth, that person will be handed over to the ruler who is on high, who rules as king over the powers. And the ruler will turn him away and cast him down from on high into the abyss, and he will be imprisoned in a cramped, dark place, so he cannot turn or move because of the great depth of Tartarus and the burdensome bitterness of Hades. And so Tartarus, Tartaros, that's the name of the underworld. I hope I spelled that right, Tartaros. Yeah. And so Tartarus is the name for the underworld. And my point to presenting a female as being like a male with no makeup and a buzz cut is because Essenes, Rosicrucians, and Buddhists, all in their teachings, they all teach that it is absolutely essential and required to subdue your sexual passions and desires. And so Jesus is explaining, reassuring this person, don't worry if people don't listen to you. They will pay for that. They will pay for it if they don't listen to you. And, you know, it doesn't really sound like something that Jesus would say to a male, especially a cocky, prideful Jewish male who, they were very, very prideful, especially back then. He probably wouldn't have to reassure them that people would listen to them or wouldn't listen to them. They probably wouldn't be worried about whether people would listen to them or not. But it certainly would make sense if he was talking to Mary. Mary would definitely have concern for whether people would listen to her or follow her teaching or her instruction, especially after Peter wanted to expel her just because she's female. So, and then my last points that I want to make, Mary wouldn't make a very good leader or spiritual teacher if she was all dolled up, for the club and everybody was lusting after her. Then she would be basically a tool for Ahriman or Satan. But again, it sounds to me like Jesus is trying to reassure a female, because men usually aren't worried about people listening to them or following them. As I was mentioning a moment ago, especially prideful prideful Jewish men. But Mary certainly would have a lot of reason for concern, as I explained. So that's going to wrap up today's today's lesson, and I hope you will join me again next week. Thanks for watching.